Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is John S. Ray's Episcopal Church Court Women Priest Case, 1974 to 1976. This was originally published as Zook Family Memories Collection, or ZFMC number 25, published on August 17, 1989. The pinnacle of John S. Ray's legal career, his defense of the Reverend Peter Beebe in the Episcopal Church Court's Women Priest Case, 1974 to 1976. Letter from the editor of the ZFMC. Yours truly, Peter J. Ray. This issue concerns the pinnacle of my dad's legal career as far as he is concerned. It may very well be the pinnacle of the Zook Family Memories Collection, and its printing is long overdue. The bottom line in what follows is that my dad played a major role in opening up the priesthood for women in the Episcopal Church. At that time, my parents received little support for their work in their own parish in Lakewood, Ohio, St. Peter's Episcopal Church. Later, St. Peter's hired a female minister, Gay Jennings, who was dearly loved by the congregation. The role of my sister's death in 1971 and all of that is clearly presented. I know you will find this issue touching and interesting. Thanks for some great copy, Dad, and good work. So this presentation involves a number of newspaper articles, a few magazine articles that deal with the topic. The first is from the Cleveland Press newspaper, April 9th, 1976. The headline is, Beebe's Lawyer Didn't Give Up, by George R. Plagan's religion editor. John Ray's favorite saying is, always keep pushing. You never can tell when you're just a quarter of an inch from the other side of the wall. It was that philosophy which influenced Ray not to give up when almost everyone was telling him he didn't have a chance to overturn the conviction of his client, Reverend Peter Beebe, in the celebrated case involving the women priests. When Beebe was found guilty by an ecclesiastical court of the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio last June, Ray had the option of seeking an appeal from a provincial church court in Wisconsin. But Ray was told that the chances of an appeals court reversing a diocesan court were slim at best. Furthermore, the bishop of the appeals court was Bishop Stanley Atkins of the Diocese of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, who was on record as strongly opposing women priests. Ray, however, who thought he should have won the decision at the Akron, Ohio trial last spring, had a feeling he was only, quote, a quarter of an inch from the other side of the wall. And victory. He decided to push for the appeal. This week, Ray and Beebe were vindicated. The appeals court ruled that Beebe had a right to a new trial because of procedural errors by the diocesan court. Both Ray and the former Oberlin rector say they are ready for a new trial and would actually welcome one. There is a possibility, however, that the diocese will decide to drop the matter, which would have the effect of exonerating Beebe by itself. Ray himself confesses he was surprised at the decision of the appeals court, but at no point, he says, did he give up on his chances of winning. For most verdicts like this, the 52-year-old Rocky River attorney would be well paid. Not in this instance. Ray has not taken a single penny in fees for his work on the Beebe case. Why? In one sense, it is typical of Ray, who has been associated throughout his career with social service work, but it also goes back to a tragedy in the lives of John Ray and his wife Ruth. When their 16-year-old daughter Pamela died suddenly 5 years ago, it made a big change in their lives. With Pam's death, we became aware of how short life is, says Ray. We decided that if there was anything worth doing for others, the time to do it was now. They became interested in the cause of the women priests in the Episcopal Church. Ray was in the congregation at Christ Church Oberlin on Sunday, December 8, 1974, when Reverend Carter Haywood and Reverend Allison Cheek celebrated communion there for the first time. Beebe, who had been warned by Bishop John Burt 5 days earlier not to go on with the service, figured he was going to need a lawyer. He had met Ray once before, and when he saw him in the congregation, he decided to ask him to represent him. The 6'2" attorney delighted many of the spectators at the Beebe trial with his Dickensian wit. Some were reminded of Joseph Welch, the picturesque attorney in the Army McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. A native of Marion, Ohio, Ray graduated from Oberlin College and from Cleveland Marshall Law School cum laude. His law firm is Myers, Stevens, and Ray. Chosen as Cleveland's Young Man of the Year in 1959, Ray is past president of the local chapter of the World Federalists and the Cleveland Junior Chamber of Commerce. He has been an officer of the Cleveland Welfare Federation and the Cleveland Church Federation. The Rays are members of St. Peter's Episcopal Church, Lakewood, whose rector, Reverend Richard Morris, is a member of the Ecclesiastical Court, which found Beebe guilty. The next article is from the Witness magazine. I think this is a church magazine, and the headline is Beebe Case, Clue to the Future. This was written by John S. Ray. The Peter Beebe case is closed, but the words charges dismissed may reverberate all the way to General Convention and beyond. The Court of Review decision in Ohio, June 11th, will make it extremely difficult for any prosecutor to convict a priest who invites women priests into his diocese to perform priestly acts, and it would certainly appear that if General Convention does not act in favor of women priests, it is just a matter of time before some ecclesiastical court, using the Beebe decision as authority, will hold that the canons as they now stand permit the ordination of women. To put it bluntly, if General Convention does not do it, an ecclesiastical court is going to do it. A review of the facts in the Beebe case reveals why. On July 29, 1974, in Philadelphia, 11 women were ordained to the priesthood in the Episcopal Church. A storm of controversy arose at once as to the validity of these ordinations. In August 1974, at a special meeting in Chicago, the House of Bishops declared that the ordinations were not valid. Subsequently, the Reverend L. Peter Beebe, with the majority support of his vestry, invited 2 of the women to Christ Church Oberlin to celebrate Holy Communion on December 8, 1974. These 2 women were not licensed to perform priestly acts in the Diocese of Ohio. Both had been inhibited by the Bishop of Ohio from coming into the diocese and performing priestly acts. Furthermore, Father Beebe had been admonished by the Bishop of Ohio not to have the women come in. In spite of this, Father Beebe allowed the service. Shortly after, the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Ohio ordered Father Beebe to trial. On May 13th, 14th, and 15th, 1975, at St. Paul's Church, Akron, Ohio, Father Beebe was tried before a diocesan court of 5 priests and unanimously found guilty of the 2 charges lodged against him. 1. Disobeying the godly admonition of his bishop, and 2. Violating Title III, Canon 24 of the General Convention, which provides, no minister in charge of any congregation of this church, or in case of vacancy or absence, no church wardens, vestrymen, or trustees of the congregation shall permit any person to officiate therein without sufficient evidence of his being duly licensed or ordained to minister in this church. The trial court conviction was appealed to the Court of Review of Province 5. Although the court was created in 1904, this was the first case it had ever heard. The court is made up of 1 bishop, 3 presbyters, and 3 lay communicants, 2 of whom are lawyers. The Court of Review unanimously reversed the conviction on April 3, 1976, and sent the case back to the trial court with specific directions as to how a new trial was to be conducted. Retrial was set for June 30th at Trinity Cathedral, Cleveland. Several weeks before the scheduled retrial date, the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Ohio, by a divided vote, dismissed the charges against Father Beebe. The reversal came as a surprise. So all inhibitions against Father Beebe have been lifted, and he is a priest in good standing once again in the Diocese of Ohio. The reversal of a conviction came as a complete surprise to almost everyone. The question presents itself: what effect, if any, will the Court of Review decision have on General Convention? The polity of the Episcopal Church is similar to that of the U.S. government in that each has an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. A balance of power is supposed to exist among the 3. In the Church, the overwhelming balance of power has been with the legislative branch, General Convention. Power exercised by the executive branch has varied depending upon the presiding bishop. The judicial branch has almost completely atrophied through disuse. In the Beebe case, however, the judicial machinery was dramatically brought to life. The General Convention canons, because they have been used so seldom, have many gaps with regard to the judicial process. The only meaningful language in the General Convention canons with regards to the mechanics of how a trial should be conducted are in Title 4, Canon 3F, Section 21. No mention is made in the canons at all as to whether cases shall be tried as criminal or civil matters, as to what degree of proof is required of the prosecutor, as to whether members of the trial court sit as judges or as jurors. This is of great importance because voir dire examination of the individual members of the court may be conducted by trial counsel in the event the members of the court are characterized as jurors. In the Beebe case, by trial motion, counsel for defendant asked the court to try the case as a criminal case, and therefore asked that the prosecutor be required to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt. This motion was overruled. By pre-trial motion, counsel for the defense also asked that the members of the trial court be treated as jurors and that the defense be permitted to examine them individually, in open court, each prospective member of the court as to his possible bias or prejudice. It was the ruling of the trial court that the prospective members thereof could not be so questioned. On appeal, the Court of Review agreed that the case indeed should have been tried as a criminal case, reversed, and sent the case back for a new trial. On appeal, the Court of Review held that the members of the trial court sat both as judges and jurors, and that the individual members of the prospective court were, therefore, subject to voir dire examination by counsel as to their possible bias and prejudice. The court therefore reversed on this ground also and sent the case back for a new trial. Rulings set precedent. These first two rulings of the Court of Review clearly establish a precedent which will probably be followed in the future. This means that the prosecutor will have a much more difficult time in proving his case because he will now be required to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt. At the time of the trial of the Beebe case, with respect to the alleged violations of Title II, Canon 24, counsel for defense pointed out that the critical language of the charge was as follows: "No minister in charge of any congregation of this church shall permit any person to officiate therein, without sufficient evidence of his being duly licensed or ordained to minister in this church." Little words mean a lot. The key word in that charge is the word "or." The overall import of the trial court decision was that the word "or" really should be treated as the word "and." It then went on to hold the obvious. Since the women admittedly were not licensed, Father Beebe was guilty of violating this canon. The Court of Review reversed and held that the word "or" meant exactly that. Thus, the issue was squarely raised as to whether the women had been ordained. The Council of Review ordered that this question be resolved by the new court at the time of retrial. Therefore, the prosecutor was faced with the task of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that there was not sufficient evidence that the women were ordained. It is obvious from the action taken by the prosecutor in recommending dismissal of the charges shortly before the second trial that he did not feel that he could prove his case. With regard to the godly admonition charge, it is worth noting that the Court of Review decision made several important points. First, the fact that a bishop tells one of his priests to do or not to do something does not per se establish such statement as a godly admonition. The decision establishes several criteria against which an alleged godly admonition must be measured. It is interesting to note also that the consent of a bishop issuing an alleged godly admonition to one of his priests must be had before a priest must stand trial for disobeying the alleged godly admonition. Those priests by Reverend Suzanne Hyatt, Episcopal Divinity School. In the hullabaloo surrounding the trials of Peter Beebe and William Went for allowing women priests to celebrate the Eucharist in churches where they were rectors, it is easy to get the impression that except for those two occasions, the women priests have been quiescent over the past 2 years. Recently, a congregation that had contracted with two of the women for regular celebrations was told by a diocesan official that theirs was the only parish in the country still inviting women priests, and that only 2 Episcopal priests were still accepting such invitations. This, of course, is not true. The women priests are alive and well, and most continue to act as priests. One has joined the Methodist Church, and another is in the process of being deposed as a presbyter who has abandoned the communion of this church. Most of the rest of us continue to celebrate the Eucharist with small groups of Christians or Episcopal churches in exile or in parish churches. While these celebrations have become too numerous to keep track of, it is certain that since November 1974, Episcopal women priests have celebrated the Eucharist in no less than 30 Episcopal congregations, parish churches, missions, and college chaplaincies. These celebrations have occurred in 12 different dioceses. In 2 dioceses, women priests celebrate unhindered by bishops' sanctions, and in several parishes they have become regular visiting clergy. In addition, Episcopalians and other Christians have attended celebrations of the Eucharist by women priests in ecumenical or non-official gatherings in at least 20 other dioceses. Women priests have also presided at baptisms, marriages, and funerals. A number have been invited by parishes in several dioceses to celebrate after the General Convention regardless of its decision. And so, backed and supported by a growing number of Episcopalians, clergy, and lay, the women priests continue their ministry in hope and thanksgiving. Reverend Susan Hyatt, Episcopal Divinity School. Now, the next article is from Oberlin Alumni Magazine, September-October 1975. And the article is by John S. Ray. The title is Reviving Atrophied Ecclesiastical Judicial Machinery. The writer is a partner in the Cleveland law firm of Myers, Stevens, and Ray. He received the LL.B. cum laude from Cleveland Marshall Law School in 1951 after majoring in chemistry at Oberlin. He is an active member of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Cleveland, an Oberlin alumni admissions rep, member of the Lake Erie Girl Scouts Special Gifts Committee, trustee of the Arthritis Foundation, and member of the advisory board and past president of the Lake Erie Junior Nature and Science Center. In 1959, he was Cleveland's Young Man of the Year, and he is past president of the Cleveland JCs, Protestant Big Brothers, United World Federalists, and Regional Council of Episcopal Churches. At Easter sunrise, April 11th, 1971, while our family was vacationing on one of the small islands in the Bahamas, our 16-year-old daughter Pamela suddenly died. We did not know until after the autopsy was performed in Nassau several days later that her death was caused by juvenile-onset diabetes. Pamela had a beautiful spirit. She always had a genuine concern for the welfare of others. She had lived longer and more deeply than many folks who live out their full 70. Her ideas and many activities, as well as those of our 3 other children, were a source of great delight to our family. After Pamela's death, we began to hear countless stories of tragedy and terrible grief in the lives of others. It was as if our eyes were suddenly opened, and we were really able to see for the first time. My wife Ruth and I found ourselves becoming much more aware of the needs of others. This led to a strong desire to help others when they needed help. The desire resulted in action in many, many cases. My wife Ruth has done an outstanding job in recognizing needs of other people and then taking appropriate action. Before our daughter's death, we considered ourselves good Christians. Our family had been faithful church attenders for many years, and our whole family had been very active in the life of the Episcopal Church. When the woman priest issue presented itself, we were disappointed by the lack of activity, interest, and discussion of the issue in our parish. My wife learned that a young priest at Christ Church in Oberlin, Ohio, is taking positive action to establish agreement that women have the same right as men to be priests in our denomination. Our family attended a service at Christ Church in November 1974 and met the young priest, the Reverend L. Peter Beebe. He was full of enthusiasm and anxious to apply the word of our Lord to life in our church and to the daily lives of the members of his parish. as well as himself, his wife Judy, and their 2 sons. He believed that the word was being ignored by the refusal of the Episcopal Church to recognize the women priests. Our family returned to Christ Church December 8, 1974, when 2 women priests celebrated communion at the Reverend Mr. Beebe's invitation. The church was packed. The service was inspiring. Also, a number of clergymen and laymen attended the service for the sole purpose of signing charges against Mr. Beebe for allegedly breaking the canon law of the church. At the end of the service, Mr. Beebe told me that he thought he was going to be charged with some violations of canon law and would need a lawyer. Would I represent him if he were charged? I told him I would. I was glad to do so on one condition, that there be no fee for my services. It seemed to my wife and me that a terrible injustice was going to happen to Mr. Beebe, and we wanted to help. At that time, I knew absolutely nothing about the canons of our church, but I had been a trial lawyer for 23 years, and I was willing to learn. My wife and I simply could not believe that Beebe had violated any of the church's laws. After studying the canons, I was absolutely convinced that Mr. Beebe had not violated any of them. I then proceeded into the legal thicket of an ecclesiastical court trial and appeals. On July 29, 1974, in Philadelphia, 11 women had been ordained. A storm of controversy arose at once as to the validity of these ordinations. In August 1974, at a special meeting of the House of Bishops in Chicago, the House declared their conviction that the ordinations were not valid. When Mr. Beebe, with the majority support of his vestry, invited 2 of the women to Christ Church to celebrate communion, December 8, 1974, the women were not licensed to perform priestly acts in the Diocese of Ohio. Both women had been inhibited by the Bishop of Ohio from coming into the Diocese of Ohio and performing priestly acts. Furthermore, Mr. Beebe had been admonished by the bishop not to have the women come into the diocese and perform priestly acts. Shortly after the service, charges were filed against Mr. Beebe. The Standing Committee of the Diocese of Ohio ordered him to trial. On May 13th, 14th, and 15th, 1975, at St. Paul's Church, Akron, Ohio, Mr. Beebe was tried before a diocesan court of 5 priests and unanimously found guilty of the 2 charges. He was charged with violating Title III, Canon 24 of the General Convention Canons, which provides, quote, "No minister in charge of any congregation of this church, or in case of vacancy or absence, no church wardens, vestrymen, or trustees of the congregation shall permit any person to officiate therein without sufficient evidence of his being duly licensed or ordained to minister in this church, provided nothing herein shall be so construed as a. To forbid communicants of this church to act as lay readers, or b. To prevent the bishop of any diocese from giving permission. I. To a minister of this church to invite a minister of another church to assist in the Book of Common Prayer, offices of holy matrimony, or of the burial of the dead, or to read the morning or evening prayer in the manner specified in Canon 3, 25, Section 4:1. Or 2. To a minister of any other church to preach the gospel, or 3. To godly persons who are not ministers of this church to make addresses in the church on special occasions. Mr. Beebe was also convicted of disobeying the godly admonition of his bishop. The conviction was appealed to the Court of Review of Province 5. This court was created in 1904, and this appeal was the first case ever heard by it. The Court of Review is made up of 7 persons, 1 bishop, 3 presbyters, and 3 lay communicants, 2 of whom must be lawyers. Briefs were prepared and filed prior to oral argument, which was held at St. James Church, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, February 24, 1976. In its decision of April 3, 1976, the Court of Review unanimously reversed the conviction and sent the case back to the trial court for a new trial with specific directions as to how the new trial was to be conducted. Retrial was set for June 30, 1976 at Trinity Cathedral, Cleveland, Ohio. Several weeks before the scheduled retrial date, on recommendation of the prosecutor, the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Ohio, by a divided vote, dismissed the charges against Mr. Beebe. The case soon was officially closed, and Mr. Beebe had all inhibitions against him lifted and became a priest in good standing in the Diocese of Ohio. The reversal of the conviction came as a surprise to almost everyone. The question immediately presented itself as to what effect, if any, the Court of Review decision would have, or should have, on General Convention when it met in September in Minneapolis and considered the woman-priest issue. The polity of our church is similar to that of the U.S. government, in that there is an executive, legislative, and judicial branch, and there is supposed to be a balance of power. The legislative branch, General Convention, however, has been over-powerful. The amount of power exercised by the executive branch has varied depending upon the individual strength of the presiding bishop. The judicial branch has almost completely atrophied because it has lain idle. In the Beebe case, the judicial machinery was dramatically brought to life. The General Convention canons, because they have been used so seldom, have many gaps with regard to the judicial process. The only meaningful language with regard to the mechanics of how a trial should be conducted are contained in Title IV, Canon 3F, Section 21. No mention at all as to what may be considered as criminal or as civil matters. There is no proof. There is no mention of what degree of proof shall be required of the prosecutor. There is no ruling as to whether members of the trial court sit as judges or jurors. This question is of great importance because voir dire examination of the individual members of the court may be conducted by trial counsel in the event of the members of the court are characterized as jurors. In the Beebe case, by pre-trial motion, counsel for defendant asked the court to try the case as a criminal case and therefore asked that the prosecutor be required to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt. This motion was overruled. We also asked that the members of the trial court be treated as jurors and that the defense be permitted to examine individually, in open court, each prospective member of the court as to his possible bias or prejudice. It was the ruling of the trial court that the prospective members could not be so questioned in an appeal court. On appeal, the Court of Review agreed that the case indeed should have been tried as a criminal case and reversed and sent the case back for a new trial on this count. Over the years, I have tried many difficult cases in many courts. None, however, has been more challenging or called for more creative input than the Beebe case. My wife and I worked together on this case from the beginning and marched through all the many legal tangles and thoroughly enjoyed it all. Our whole family was caught up in the spirit. The end result for Mr. Beebe was that he was cleared of all charges. The woman priest issue was narrowly resolved in September. Our main hope, however, is that somehow, through all of this, the will of our Lord is being done. Now, there's an article from the Cleveland Press newspaper, December 28th, 1974, the religion section, and the headline is, Beebe is Man of the Year. That's for the religion section of the Cleveland Press. Risk career over women priests. Beware of bishops, Peter Beebe said, who sit in motel lobbies and who meet in long sessions in places like Mexico. That was a reference to the House of Bishops meeting the week before when the Episcopal prelates reiterated their position that the 11 women, including Reverend Cheek, who were ordained to the Episcopal priesthood in Philadelphia in July, had taken part in an uncanonical act. Therefore, they were not priests, said the bishops, and could not function as priests. Specifically, this meant they could not celebrate Holy Communion. Not only was Reverend Cheek in violation of the bishop's strict directive when she consecrated the bread and wine at St. Stephen's altar, so was Reverend Wendt, who had invited her. Reverend Beebe placed himself in similar ecclesiastical jeopardy by subsequently inviting Reverend Cheek and two of the other irregularly ordained women priests to celebrate communion at Christ Church in Oberlin in December. Reverend Cheek and Reverend Carter Haywood celebrated communion not once but twice at the Oberlin Church on Sunday, December 8th. The third woman invited, Reverend Jeanette Picard, read the gospel at the services but did not take part in the communion. Both Reverend Wendt and Reverend Beebe now face the possibility of being put on trial by their denomination. With Reverend Wendt, a trial is almost a certainty. 17 clergy in his diocese brought charges against him following his act of defiance, and his diocese's board of presenters has called for an ecclesiastical trial, probably in the spring. Reverend Beebe's case is now before the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Ohio. Peter Beebe looks anything but a radical. Rather, he is the picture of what most people think of as a typical young Episcopal divine. He has that well-bred look, sophisticated, urbane, casual in manner. His hair is stylishly long. Reverend Beebe's father was a former Ford Motor Company executive who organized the Hungarian Relief Program. Woman of the Year, Reverend Carter Haywood, the most photographed and most quoted of the Episcopal women priests, is the Press Religion page's Woman of the Year. As anyone who objects to sexist terminology, Reverend Haywood would probably prefer the designation Co-Person of the Year. How the sexist word men has been replaced with people in the angel's Christmas greeting. After Bishop Burt took the hardline stance against the Philadelphia ordinations, Reverend Beebe became convinced that for the first time in his life he had to take a stand which would put his career on the line. He invited 3 of the 11 women priests to come to Oberlin to celebrate communion. His vestry backed him by a close margin 6-5. The bishop replied, "Everything within me wishes I did not have to respond to this challenge you have made to my episcopal authority. Yet it is my duty to insist that you withdraw the invitations you have extended." Reverend Beebe made no answer. He went ahead with the preparations for the December 8th services. The week preceding the coming of the women was a miserable one for Reverend Beebe. He had a bad cold, and the telephone never stopped ringing. Most of the callers were critical. They were well-meaning, but they wanted to know why I was doing this, he recalls. There was also a barrage of critical mail. The calls have mostly stopped now, says Reverend Beebe, and the mail has taken a turn. It's now largely supportive. The mail is mostly from lay persons. Only 2 or 3 clergy in the diocese have given their backing to the Oberlin rector, mainly Reverend Robert Hall of Steubenville and Reverend Richard Baker, Reverend Beebe's predecessor at Christ Church, who now teaches at Western Reserve Academy. Reverend Beebe believes that most members of his parish take his side in the dispute. How is he himself holding up under the ordeal? "I feel fantastic," says Reverend Beebe. "Really fantastic. I am convinced of the rightness of my action. Only one thing saddens me, that is what this whole affair says to the world about our church." Now there's a photo from the Cleveland Press, January 15, 1975. Accused clergyman Reverend L. Peter Beebe, rector of Christ Church in Oberlin, is shown arriving at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral today for a hearing before the Diocesan Standing Committee. Beebe is charged with violating the canons of his church by allowing women priests to celebrate communion in his parish in December. His lawyer, John Ray of Rocky River, accompanies him. In another article in the Chicago Tribune, January 18, 1975, the photo's caption is "The Reverend L. Peter Beebe Wright with attorney John Ray." Episcopal trial ordered over women priests. Cleveland, Ohio. The bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio has ordered an ecclesiastical court to try the Reverend L. Peter Beebe on charges of breaking canon law by allowing 2 women priests to celebrate communion in his church. The Reverend Mr. Beebe has testified before the Diocesan Standing Committee earlier this week, prior to the committee's 7-1 decision to recommend a trial. A clergyman on the committee, composed of 4 laymen and 4 clergymen, was the only dissenter. Ohio Bishop Burt studied the recommendation before announcing late Thursday an order to convene what will be Ohio's first Episcopal ecclesiastical court in more than 50 years. If the Reverend Mr. Beebe is found guilty of the charges, the bishop can censure, suspend, or depose him. On December 8th, the Reverend Mr. Beebe, age 29, allowed 2 of 11 women ordained as priests in Philadelphia last July to perform communion in Oberlin, Ohio Church. Besides defying canon law, he disregarded an order from the bishop that the women not be allowed to participate. Here's an article from the Cleveland Press, March 1975. Episcopal Bishop withdraws support of Priest Under Fire by George R. Plagan's religion editor. Reverend Peter Beebe, rector of Christ Episcopal Church, Ohio, may face suspension or even defrocking if he is found guilty by an ecclesiastical court of breaking church law. Reverend John Burt of the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio, who told a press conference in January that the 29-year-old rector definitely would not be deposed as a priest even if he were found to be guilty, has indicated in a letter to Reverend Beebe that he is withdrawing that assurance. In a strongly worded personal letter to Reverend Beebe, the contents of which have been made available to the press, the bishop has charged the rector with having, quote, undercut my good faith in your word. Bishop Burt says Reverend Beebe promised him in November that his invitation to Reverend Allison Cheek to celebrate Holy Communion at Christ Church December 8th would be, quote, a single protest event, and not, quote, the beginning of a continuing and constant flouting of the canon. It was, of course, on the basis of this assurance, says the bishop in his letter, that I indicated at the January 16th press conference that your sentence, if you were found guilty, would be minimal. In the case of a priest being found guilty by a church court, the bishop can issue a reprimand, suspend, or depose the clergyman. The news stand by the bishop is the result of a second invitation issued by Reverend Beebe to Reverend Cheek to celebrate Holy Communion at his church. Reverend Cheek, one of the 11 irregularly ordained women priests in the Episcopal Church, accepted the invitation. She celebrated the Eucharist twice last Sunday at the Oberlin Church. Reverend Cheek first celebrated communion there with Reverend Carter Haywood, another of the women priests, on December 8th. This led to Reverend Beebe's being charged with breaking canon law. The church hierarchy insists that canon law limits the priesthood to men. Reverend Beebe disagrees. He claims that what he is doing is consistent with church law. This will be the substance of his defense when he goes on trial Tuesday, May 13th at Grace Church, Sandusky. Reverend Beebe says Bishop Burt's statement that the Oberlin rector promised not to invite a woman priest after December simply is not correct. I made it clear to the bishop, says Reverend Beebe, that on this issue I did not know what I would do after December 8th. Reverend Beebe says the bishop's letter to him implies there may be no room in our church for those who are consistent and repetitive in acting out beliefs which are in conflict with the bishop's position. Photograph of Bishop Burt and Peter Beebe, new confrontation. Episcopal Bishop John Burt at a January 16th news conference with Reverend Peter Beebe now has charged the Oberlin rector with breaking his word. As a result, the bishop has indicated that Reverend Beebe can no longer count on the bishop's promise given at the news conference not to impose on him if he is found guilty of violating canon law by an ecclesiastical court. There's an article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper, March 29, 1975, and the title is Bishops Called Hypocrites by Disputed Women Priests by Jim Strang. The Reverend Carter Haywood, one of 11 irregularly ordained women priests in the Episcopal Church, charged yesterday bishops who oppose ordination of women are hypocrites out of touch with the times. The Reverend Miss Hayward is to celebrate communion tomorrow at Christ Church Oberlin at the invitation of the Reverend Peter Beebe, pastor. The Reverend Mr. Beebe will be tried by the church in May for having allowed the Reverend Miss Hayward and another woman priest to perform similar rites in December. The charges were brought by 20 priests and laymen. On her arrival here from her home in New York City, the Reverend Miss Hayward said exclusion of women from the priesthood is unjust, immoral, and sexist. Bishop John Burt of the Ohio Episcopal Diocese, who will sentence the Reverend Mr. Beebe if he is found guilty, has said he agrees with the principle of ordination for women, but that it violates church canons. It seems odd to me that he thinks the law is wrong but still upholds it, the Reverend Miss Hayward said. To the outside world, we must look crazy, the Christian church fighting over granting civil rights to its own. Punishment for violating the canons ranges from suspension to defrocking. The Reverend Mr. Beebe agreed. It's like someone saying, I'm all for Jesus Christ, but he broke the law and has to be killed, he said. The Lambeth Conference, the ruling body for Anglicans worldwide, decided in 1970 that any of the church's 22 provinces could decide independently the question of ordaining women. So far, only the Southeast Asian province has authorized it. A woman priest from that province, the Reverend Jane Huang of Hong Kong, was invited by Bishop Burt to celebrate communion May 14th, the same day the Reverend Beebe will be on trial in Sandusky. Meanwhile, the vestry, official church board of the Reverend Mr. Beebe's church, has asked to be named a co-defendant in his trial. In a motion filed with the church court, the vestry wrote, "If Mr. Beebe is guilty of any act of misconduct whatsoever with regard to the invitation, then his parish wishes to share that guilt." Bishop Burt said in January the Reverend Mr. Beebe's punishment would be minimal, but after the minister announced plans to repeat the celebration, the bishop wrote the Reverend Mr. Beebe that he was disappointed concerning what now appears to be your decision to engage in a continuing breaking of canons. The bishop has decided to refrain from any public comment on the situation. Now, there's another article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, no date. The headline is Beebe Defense Keys Case to Issue of Women Priests by Darrell Holland, Religion Editor. Akron, Ohio. An Episcopal court opened in its trial of the Reverend L. Peter Beebe yesterday and found itself forced to fight off the priest's attempts to make the ordination of women the key issue. The Ecclesiastical Court of the Ohio Diocese tried to operate as if it were trying the Oberlin priest only for disobeying his bishop by permitting two irregularly ordained women to celebrate communion last December. But the defense, led by John S. Ray, a Cleveland lawyer, called the women's ordinations the central issue and tried to introduce evidence to prove the validity of the ordinations last July in Philadelphia. The defense apparently had won that right in a pre-trial hearing in Sandusky, April 22, when the court ruled the defense could argue that there was sufficient evidence that the Reverend Carter Haywood of New York and the Reverend Allison Cheek of Annandale, Virginia, were ordained as ministers in the church. However, Charles P. Baker, Jr. of Painesville, legal advisor to the court, said yesterday before the trial that validity of the women priesthood is not at stake. Now here's an article from 1975. The headline is Beebe Keys Case to Women Priests. Sterling Newell, Cleveland lawyer and church prosecutor, introduced several letters exchanged by the Reverend Beebe and Bishop Burt last fall, which he said proved the priest had violated church law by disobeying the bishop. The Reverend Mr. Beebe said he believes the women are valid priests, although their ordinations were irregular, and that he acted out of conscience, guided by Scripture, a higher authority than church law. The Book of Common Prayer, guidebook for Episcopalians, was cited, showing that at ordination a priest promises to obey his bishop, while another part of the ceremony asserts that the Scriptures are the highest authority. The Reverend Mr. Beebe maintained that his conscience, guided by Scripture, indicated women should be accepted as priests despite the bishop's objections and despite the church's ruling that they are not valid priests. The prosecution, pleading its case about 2:30 p.m., gave way to the defense, which had difficulty getting testimony of expert witnesses accepted over the constant objections of the prosecution. John S. Ray made several attempts to have the Reverend Mr. Mulligan comment on whether a priest's first responsibility was to obey the Scripture or the discipline of the church. In this case, Bishop Burt's inhibitions, the court refused to let the Reverend Mr. Mulligan respond, but he managed to say, "There are times when you obey God and not man, and there never would have been an early church if this were not so." William Stringfellow, noted Episcopal lawyer from Block Island, Rhode Island, and defense lawyer in a similar trial 2 weeks ago in Washington, D.C., told the Plain Dealer after the final session yesterday that the court took a very narrow position. Stringfellow charged that the church's bishops who have ruled the women's ordinations invalid stick together in a fraternal spirit in rejecting the women as priests. He said no further legislation is needed to accept them. There's an article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper, June 21, 1975. Reverend Beebe found guilty, court advises a warning, by Darrell Holland. The Reverend L. Peter Beebe was found guilty here yesterday of breaking Episcopal Church law by permitting 2 women priests to celebrate communion in Christ Episcopal Church in Oberlin. The court said the bishop's admonition to the Reverend Beebe should be in effect only until the last day of the denomination's general convention next year. The admonition should be lifted, the court said, if the convention fails to amend the ordination and licensing canons to remove the discriminatory and unfair practices against women. In effect, the court said it believes women should be accepted as priests in the Ohio Diocese regardless of the convention's action. Following the verdict, the Reverend Mr. Beebe told reporters he would continue to abide by the dictates of his conscience and that he would continue to welcome the 11 women who were ordained priests last summer to celebrate communion. He called the church a paternalistic system, which said to me, if you're good, the system won't punish you. The Reverend Mr. Beebe and his lawyer John S. Ray of Cleveland said they will make a decision soon as to whether to appeal the decision. There's an article from the Cleveland Press, June 23, 1975. Death of Daughter Changed Lives of Beebe's Lawyer and His Wife by George R. Plagan's Religion editor. The death of their 16-year-old daughter Pam 4 years ago made a profound change in the lives of John and Ruth Ray. It greatly deepened my faith, says Ray, the attorney for Reverend Peter Beebe of Oberlin, who was convicted Friday by an ecclesiastical court of breaking the canon law of the Episcopal Church. It also made both of us more sensitive to the problems and needs of others. Ray adds, and with Pam's sudden death, we became aware of how short life is. We decided if there was anything worth doing for others, the time to do it was now. In the plight of the irregularly ordained women priests in the Episcopal Church, the Rays found a cause they could support. It was obvious that the women priests would be approved one day, says Ray. Why delay the day? After all, one of the women priests, Jeanette Picard, is 79 years old. When Ruth Ray discovered that the issue of women priests was causing scarcely a ripple in the Rays parish, St. Peter's in Lakewood, Ohio, she wrote a letter which her husband also signed, urging the people in the Episcopal Church to take up the cause of the 11 women ordained in Philadelphia last July. One copy of the letter was sent to Beebe, the 29-year-old rector of Christ Church Oberlin, who had indicated as early as last summer that he was one of the champions of the Philadelphia 11. Peter Beebe's show of disdain for the threat of suspension was no surprise. He said Friday after the verdict was announced, I have no intention of compromising my conscience because I am threatened. But no one really expected him to act quite so swiftly in inviting the women back. Anything else would have been a cop-out, said Beebe, looking pale and weak yesterday after a bout with the flu. His temperature at one point last week was up to 104. Now here's another article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper, June 23, 1975. 2 women repeat Oberlin communion, by Darrell Holland, Oberlin, Ohio. An Episcopal priest waited only 48 hours after being found guilty by a church court before he again violated the same Episcopal Church laws here yesterday. The Reverend L. Peter Beebe, rector of Christ Church, invited women priests and thus continued his crusade against his denomination's official restriction of priesthood to males. He permitted the 2 women who had celebrated communion last December 8th to conduct the service yesterday morning and to perform priestly acts. The women concelebrated communion. It appeared an exact repeat of the service for which he was convicted, as the familiar words of the Episcopal liturgy were intoned by the Reverend Allison Cheek of Annandale, Virginia, and the Reverend Carter Haywood of New York City. In her sermon, the Reverend Mrs. Cheek said that following Jesus often creates divisiveness, noting that the controversy over women priests has divided the Episcopal Church. I will never accept ecclesiastical discipline because I have been ordained as a priest of God and will act out my conscience, act out my priesthood. The Church's House of Bishops has shown utter disregard for our priesthood and contempt for women. Most of the 100 persons at the service received communion from the women and hugged them in the exchange of peace and in greeting them after the service. It was the 8th time the women had celebrated communion at the Oberlin Church. Asked why he permitted yesterday's service so soon following his conviction, the Reverend Mr. Beebe said, "The court had said to me, if you will cop out and not obey your conscience, we won't punish you, but I will continue to permit ordained women to exercise their priesthood." He acknowledged that many persons will call him a fool for violating church laws again. I am a fool for Christ, and I am doing what is right. He had not advised Bishop Burt that he was inviting the women to celebrate communion, he said. And there's another article From the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Beebe won't obey Bishop's directive by Darrell Holland. The Reverend L. Peter Beebe said yesterday he will not obey an order of his bishop barring women priests from the priest church at Oberlin. It is a matter of conscience. The priest said he was not trying to be a rebel, but to obey the gospel and to affirm that the church is an institution concerned with justice toward women. I wish Bishop Burt would quit trying to interpret my motivation. I am not mocking or deriding. It is not a question of judicial process, but of justice I am trying to affirm. Another article says, Stay within parish, Bishop tells Beebe. From the Medina Gazette, July 25, 1975. Peter Beebe of Christ Church in Oberlin is under orders today from Ohio Episcopal Bishop John Burt to exercise his ministry only within his own parish because Reverend Mr. Beebe planned to add irregularly ordained women priests to his staff. There's an article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, September 7th, 1975. Church Clash, Women Deacons Ordained Today in Washington, D.C. by Darrell Holland, religion editor. More fuel will be added to the controversy in the Episcopal Church when 4 women deacons are ordained priests today in Washington, D.C. Since July 1974, when 11 women were ordained priests in an unauthorized service, the church has been simmering over what to do with women priests. 2 weeks after the controversial service, the church's House of Bishops met in Chicago to declare the women's priesthood invalid, but that declaration has not stopped many persons from accepting them. The women have often celebrated communion, an act reserved for priests. The church says only men can be priests. John S. Ray of Cleveland, the Reverend Mr. Beebe's lawyer, told the Plain Dealer that the court judged the church's laws that the Oberlin priest broke as unjust, but convicted him anyway. The court, Ray said, called church laws or canons inequitable and discriminatory in regard to women, and said that justice can be sought for women who are prepared for priesthood by going ahead with irregular ordinations of women. John S. Ray said, the bishops are reacting as if their authority is being challenged, rather than looking at the injustice against women. Opposing that view is the Reverend W. Chav McCracken, rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Cleveland Heights. He's a member of the Diocese's Standing Committee, which sent the Reverend Mr. Beebe's case to trial by finding probable cause for a violation of church law. And there's an article from the Chronicle Telegram, April 7th, 1976. Church unit orders new Beebe trial. In a totally unexpected decision, an Episcopal Church appeals court has reversed the verdict which found the Reverend L. Peter Beebe guilty of violating canon law, the Chronicle Telegram has learned. April 8, 1976, Reverend Beebe is ready for a second trial. Reverend Peter Beebe, stunned by the Episcopal Appeals Court verdict which overturned his conviction by a local ecclesiastical court, said he stands ready and willing to go on trial again. John S. Ray said, quote, there may still be hope for the Episcopal Church. We were treated so harshly in this diocese that it is almost unbelievable that we finally ran into a group of Christian people in that court who listened and responded to what we said. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, April 24th, 1976. Woman priest expects more to follow by Christine J. Gendra. The Reverend Carter Haywood, one of 15 women who have been ordained priests in the Episcopal Church, predicts that at least 100 more women will be ordained next fall with or without the sanction of the Church's General Conference. 200 women qualified to become priests are waiting for the decision of the conference in September in Minneapolis on the question of ordaining women. The Reverend Miss Hayward, age 30, said this week. She was in Cleveland to promote her book, A Priest Forever, which details her struggle in deciding to seek ordination. She was ordained in July 1974 with 10 other women in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia Diocese, in an action called Irregular, and 4 more women were ordained last year in Washington. It's like the race struggle, she said. I'm just like the blacks in Montgomery who were told they were being arrested for sitting on the front of the bus because that was the law. Her book discusses the ways she began to challenge such thinking. She said, "It is a story of my spiritual journey and a story of a child growing up. People tell me it's a mirror through which other women can relate to all areas of their lives." Cleveland Press, May 27, 1976. Retrial is welcomed by Beebe's counsel, by George R. Plagan's religion editor. We'll be ready, said a jubilant John S. Ray today on being informed by the Ecclesiastical Court of the Episcopal Diocese of Ohio that his client, Reverend Peter Beebe, had been granted a retrial. Now we have 3 comments based on the original publication, and the first is from my father, John S. Ray. Thanks so much for your good effort in putting together the ZFMC about the woman priest case. This was a real challenge for you, and what you have published certainly caught the spirit of the case. My memory of some of the details is still quite vivid, but other parts have faded. Your efforts in preserving this very exciting part of your mother and my lives is very much appreciated. John S. Ray, Cleveland, Ohio. And another letter to the editor is from Alicia Garcia Ni Ray, my dear wife Alice, from the Quezon City, Philippines. Thanks a lot for the ZFMC issue 25 that I have received this morning. This is sensational. Your dear dad has a very strong personality, very courageous, a man for others, and a winner too. Alicia Garcia, Quezon City, Philippines. And another letter to the editor from my dear wife Alice. Alicia Garcia Ni Ray. This is really something that everyone should read. I got some reflections in this issue which helped me understand some of the things, most especially about what your dad said, that how short life is, and if there's anything worth doing for others, the time to do it is now. Alicia Garcia Ray, Quezon City, Philippines. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.